So on behalf of the university, I'd like to welcome you to this 50th anniversary special lecture. We're very pleased to have Carolyn Jackson, Professor of Gender and Education from our Department of Educational Research, to give the lecture this evening. So, as most of you know, Lancaster was founded in 1964, and educational research was one of the early groundbreaking departments of the university. But Carolyn's research focuses particularly on gender issues in education. And much of her work over the last decade has focused on aspects of laddism or lad culture. She has undertaken various projects on boys' and girls' motives for laddish behaviours in secondary schools, leading to numerous articles and a book, Lads and Ladettes in School, Gender and a Fear of Failure. And the book was awarded the first prize by the Society for Educational Studies. But in recent years, Carolyn's focus has moved away from laddism in secondary schools to laddism in universities. And her most recent project explores the perceptions of university staff about whether lad culture is a problem in higher education. And that's going to be the topic of her talk this evening.
So lad cultures then in education. Concerns about lad cultures proliferated in the UK media early in 2013. There were some reports about lad cultures in the media in 2012, but it was in 2013 that they really took off. This quotation from The Guardian in spring 2013 is a fairly typical example of how lad cultures were, and indeed still are, portrayed in the press. Student lad culture has become a national issue. The phenomenon, often associated with the website Unilad, has become a catch-all term for anything from boozy boisterousness to casual misogyny and even sexual abuse. But despite numerous media reports on laddism, universities still have little idea of how widespread its effects are. So what kinds of incidents and practices have prompted these media reports? And I'll give you a few examples just to give you an illustration of what's behind these kinds of reports. So early newspaper headlines tended to focus on anecdotal accounts of practices such as so-called slut drop-in, where male students offered women students lift home after nighttime socials, but then just left them stranded in the middle of nowhere, miles away from their homes. And also hazing, which are initiation ceremonies that are usually linked to male sports teams. And concerns have been fueled by websites such as Unilad, a misogynist website with a related Facebook site with just short of 4 million likes. And Unilad's had various incarnations. In its first, it featured an article on sexual mathematics that included the following. If the girl you've taken for a drink won't spread for your head, think about this mathematical statistic. 85% of rape cases go unreported. That seems to be fairly good odds. Lad culture does not condone rape without saying surprise. Sorry, Unilad does not. And there was a video released as well that last calendar year of chanting by some students at the University of Nottingham that included a line about digging up a female corpse and having sex with it. And this was a particularly shocking and foul chant, and you'll be pleased to hear that. I'm not going to share that with you this evening. But what I will show you is a couple of minutes of a video from students at Stirling University who were singing on a public bus. And the incident was filmed on a mobile phone, so the quality's not great. But despite that, I think the footage will give you a sense of the kinds of incidents that are being referred to as lad culture.
A lady came into the store one day asking for some material. Some material she wanted. Felt she got. I don't work here anymore. A lady came into the store one day asking for a German method of coal extraction. A German method of coal extraction she wanted. Fine shaft she got.
Okay, it does go on, but I think you've probably heard enough. You can see that some passengers, men as well as women, clearly feel uncomfortable on this bus, and it's not surprising. And of course, that highlights that lad culture isn't a problem just for women, but it's a problem for many men as well. An anonymous passenger was quoted in the Independent newspaper as saying, "The atmosphere in the bus was incredibly tense. People were muttering and were clearly discussing, but it's incredibly intimidating to say anything to a big group." And I suspect that having seen that clip, we can all get a sense of, can all relate to that. Now, of course, the media is known to sensationalize issues from time to time. So we're left with questions about whether these are isolated incidents, which, whilst problematic, are rare. Do we need to be concerned about lad culture in higher education, or is it media hype? The notion of the lad has quite a long history, and I won't go into that. But the lad culture referred to today, also known as laddish culture, laddism, or even new lad, emerged or re-emerged in the 1990s and is linked to so-called lads mags such as Loaded and then later Nuts and Zoo, and also with TV shows such as Men Behaving Badly. And lad culture is sometimes portrayed as a reaction against the new man of the 1980s, who's portrayed as accepting equality in domestic life, happy to do the washing up, or even horror of horrors, change a nappy. So some commentators question whether the term laddish or lad culture is appropriate to apply to some of the behaviours that we see in university contexts, as arguably it downplays the seriousness of them. For example, Catherine Nixie, writing in The Times, suggests that laddism is a jolly term for what is actually sexual harassment. Well, it isn't just the media that have been concerned and are concerned about lad culture. The National Union of Students, or what I refer to as the NUS from now on, which is a confederation of about 600 student unions, are also very concerned about it. And their concern was sufficiently strong to prompt them to commission some research in 2012, which explored lad culture and women's experiences of it. And the research was undertaken by Alison Phipps and Isabel Young, and they interviewed 40 women undergraduates. And I'll draw on this research as I go through the rest of the talk. And I'll also draw on Steve Dempster's work, which involved interviews with 24 male undergraduates at one university in the UK, and also a much larger survey of male students at the same institution. And I'll also draw a lot on my own research, and it's a project that I'm currently undertaking with Vanita Sundaram at the University of York, and it involves 80 in-depth interviews with staff. So based on this, and on other research where relevant, for the remainder of the talk, I'm going to address 3 questions. What is lad culture in higher education from the perspective of higher education students and staff? Is it a big problem? And how is it being tackled, if at all? Okay, so to consider the first of these then, what is lad culture? What are we talking about when we talk about that in higher education? On the basis of their interviews with women university students, Phipps and Young suggest that lad culture was seen as a pack mentality, evident in activities such as sport and heavy alcohol consumption, and banter, which was often sexist, misogynist, and homophobic. It was also thought to be sexualized and to involve the objectification of women, and at its extremes, rape-supportive attitudes and sexual harassment and violence. And the main aspects of this definition are broadly in line with the kinds of responses we got when we talked to university staff about what lad culture is. So, for example, we were told that lad culture is football and beers and boorish behaviour and sexism as well. Behaviour by males that perhaps should know better, but it's almost expected of them to behave in a certain way. So overall then, the staff perceptions of lad culture in our project suggested that lad culture involved sexism, overt sexism, which, as I said, it is often presented as harmless fun. And it can also involve racism and homophobia, as in the quote earlier from Phipps and Young suggested. But our interviewees actually felt that racism and homophobia was far, far less of a part of it and less common than sexism. It's linked to men, mainly, but not exclusively. Some people felt that women could also and were also laddish. It's associated with alcohol and sport, especially rugby. It's associated with groups. We saw reference to the pack mentality and the notion that it's kind of tribal. And it's generally perceived negatively, but not always. Some saw it as an opportunity for men to bond and to get a sense of belonging, to build confidence and support networks. And just to end this section on what lad culture is, I want to show you 2.5 minutes of a video clip that was produced by Oxford University as part of their Good Lad project.
I think being a lad is being someone who loves to drink and loves to get with girls.
It can be like a really nice term, someone who's just really cheeky, a cheeky chappy.
But I also think it's like playing to the crowd, so it's doing those things because it's going to get you the reputation that you want, or it's going to get you the kind of recognition that you're looking for.
Sport orientated, very confident, very outspoken group of boys.
A lad is more of a kind of a mentality than a person. I think it's a certain way of acting and kind of being with another group of guys, which doesn't necessarily correspond to someone's personality all the time.
I think a lad is not really an individual concept, it's more like in relation to the peers around you.
Individuals acting in like a group, and I think of like pack mentalities, are kind of aided by alcohol and sport.
Think of a lad as a kind of identity that is performed in some ways, so that there's a kind of disparity between the person that you're used to interacting with and the person that they're being.
I think it's more of a nighttime thing, like when alcohol's introduced, when boys think it's okay to sort of push boundaries and not act in an acceptable way when they've had a few beers.
Okay, so far I've provided some examples of lad culture that have been picked up in the press, and also outlined how university staff and students perceive lad culture. So now I want to move on to the question of, is it a big problem? The National Union of Students conducted a survey that related to lad culture, or 2 surveys actually that related to lad culture. And the findings suggested that 68% of women had experienced verbal or non-verbal harassment in and around their institution. 12% of women respondents were subject to stalking. More than 1 in 10 were victims of serious sexual assault. 37% of women reported experiencing unwelcome sexual advances, for example, inappropriate touching and groping. Now, in our interviews with staff who work for the student union, so they were staff members of the university, but they'd either very recently been students or they were students who'd taken a year out to do a sabbatical post and then they'd go back to being students. They reported that in certain social spaces, sexual harassment was the norm. And there are strong indications that there's actually very little reporting that occurs. And this is reflected in the views of the majority of staff that we interviewed who weren't part of the student union. So they hadn't necessarily been students at all or recently. Some staff, although they were in the minority, said, lad culture is just not an issue here. It's not an issue at all. But the most common view amongst the staff was that lad culture is an issue. We tend to see isolated incidents and we need to take them seriously, but it's not a big issue. And a few thought that it actually was a big issue. But I think as the places and spaces where lad culture is most evident, according to the students, so bars and nightclubs, are not the spaces where staff go. What staff know about lad culture was very much shaped by what the students told them. So I think based on the evidence available, we can say that lad culture is an issue. That's not to say that all or even most men are laddish. Certainly those who perform laddishness to extremes seem to be in a small minority. And as Dempster points out, even male students who practice laddism aren't necessarily laddish all the time. Their engagements with it are often temporary, shifting and contextual. So laddism may not be a dominant form of masculinity in terms of numbers, i.e. it may be a minority of male students that are laddish, certainly in the extreme forms. But as we all know, those who are numerically in a minority can often dominate space and shape the climate and culture in a particular environment. So given all this then, how are universities working to challenge it? What are they doing to try to challenge lad culture? Now, based on the project that Vanita and I are doing, it seems that universities are not actively challenging lad culture. And I'm separating here universities from student unions. Student unions are doing quite a lot, as I'll suggest in a minute. Universities tend to deal with cases individually through the disciplinary processes, which of course is a kind of reactive approach. Something happens and they respond to it. The initiatives to challenge lad culture tend to be driven by student unions. So what types of things are student unions doing then? And again, I just want to provide some examples. The list isn't by no means exhaustive, but student unions are actually doing a lot at the moment to try to tackle lad culture. There are zero tolerance policies. There are consent workshops. So the National Union of Students are launching consent workshops at 20 universities across the country. So there's these kind of collective consent workshops, and it's notable there's very little actually done on consent in schools, which I think is a major problem, actually, a real big issue. You know, we shouldn't be doing consent workshops at university, it should be done in schools. There's the Good Lad Project at Oxford, and the clip I showed you earlier came from that. And the aim is to raise awareness about issues of violence and harassment on campus and to provide a safe space for men, because these are for men, about how to discuss issues around gender, sexuality and sex, and providing spaces for those, as it's argued they really don't have those kinds of spaces outside. And then there are some institutions, for example, Sussex, who are working to clarify complaints processes and doing training around them. Some student unions are doing poster campaigns just to promote discussion. So Newcastle University, for example, had a poster campaign where they'd put out provocative statements to try and promote discussion. So, you know, chill out, it's just banter. What kind of response does that get? What are the problems with this notion that it's just banter? Many student unions have banned sports clubs' initiation ceremonies, often because there have been some really high-profile cases that have attracted really problematic publicity for the universities. Of course, then sometimes they just go underground rather than being supported by the student unions. Then there are some social media sites for reporting sexism. So, for example, there's a Sexism at Warwick Facebook page. And then finally, the NUS have recently set up a national strategy team for challenging lad cultures. And at the moment, they're doing an audit of various universities across the country and asking student unions to reflect on the policies and the practices and the processes they engage with to tackle lad culture in their institutions. So it'll be interesting to see what emerges from that. And as I said, most of these, pretty much all of these, are student-driven. And in many ways, this is really good. It's appropriate that they should be. And it's to be applauded. But it does raise questions about the sustainability and the continuity, as I flagged earlier. And it does mean, and it certainly doesn't mean, that institutions should just sit back and leave it to students. They could do more, I think, universities. And I'll finish with just a few examples of what universities could do. Listen to students. Ensure there's enough dialogue between students and the universities about the matters that we've been talking about. They could also acknowledge that lad cultures may exist and be willing to engage with them and to learn from other institutions and students about them. So there's a tendency, I think, for some universities to be rather defensive and not want to acknowledge issues that they may be having. Universities can ensure that there's clear and appropriate policies on, for example, sexual violence, and that staff are trained in how to respond. There's actually a really interesting piece about this in the Telegraph just today about sexual violence across university campuses and how there are problems in how it's been dealt with. And also ensure that the policies and the reporting mechanisms are widely known, and take issues seriously when they're reported and to deal with them effectively. Some staff, it was a minority, but some staff felt they weren't dealt with properly because of pressures not to be too heavy on students because of student retention issues. So we need to be aware also in universities that lad cultures can exist amongst staff as well as students, and they can exist in teaching and learning environments as well as social spaces. And I've not had time to discuss at all teaching and learning environments tonight, but it'd be a subject of a whole other lecture, maybe when the university is celebrating its 100 years. But teaching and learning issues were a real issue. Ladism was a real issue in some teaching and learning contexts in some institutions. So we need universities to keep pushing for culture shift, because lad culture is a problem and we do need to tackle it. Thank you.
What is it about today, 2015, that means the media is still allowed to go ahead and show certain images. So when they stopped showing boobs or Miss World and all that on the telly, something was going on politically and people were thinking in a certain way. And now young people at uni, they're watching Geordie Shore. You know, I've seen the Newcastle... They're watching Geordie Shore, they're watching whatever it is in Ibiza, and everyone's doing all these rude things to each other, and there's all that stuff going on.
Yeah, universities clearly aren't operating within a bubble, are they? They're influenced by the world outside. So I think all these have to be influential. And also, I mean, what we're seeing at universities isn't also starting at universities. Much of my work's been done in secondary schools, and many of the behaviours and many of the issues that I've been talking about in relation to university are occurring in secondary schools. And the concerns about laddism actually started in secondary schools about 15 years ago. So the emphasis has shifted now to university context, but you know, there's that pattern. It's not starting here. Clearly it is influenced by time before university and life outside university.
Yeah, just to make a point about the broader sort of sexualised culture, I'm currently looking to do some research in this area. And certainly you do see a lot of these images which I think do feed into laddishness over and above the wanting to be part of the crowd, wanting to be popular, being with your mates. And I think more research needs to be done in that area. I think there was a start back in the sort of late 90s, early 2000s, looking at things like Loaded and the Lads mags, and that seems to have sort of died off a little bit, and I think that's going to start becoming a more important research area.
My work is predominantly in the FE sector rather than HE, and I'm currently trying to use the whole Ched Evans incident as a way to talk about this, and I've been very interested about how it seems that it was due to the sponsorship deals which has barred his progression in football. And I'm just wondering, we've talked a lot about, you mentioned how, you know, the media has a negative impact, but just wondering if you've seen any positive examples, or if that's a change in attitude through the media, really.
I think the fact that the media are highlighting some of these cases brings it to light, and I think it's some of the cases through the media that have then focused attention on the issue and mean that people are actually looking at ways to tackle it. Social media as well. I mean, social media can work both ways, can't it? I mean, a lot of the instances of laddism that we've seen in universities, I think, have been exacerbated by social media. The question that people keep asking is this new?
Yeah, just a point on the social media aspect. I think partly one of the reasons we're seeing this increase or this sort of exacerbation of laddishness or laddism or whatever you want to call it is that certainly when I was at a university, and I'm not saying which one, back in the 90s, there was definitely laddish behaviours going on. But it was very much in the moment, and that was it. It was game over. So something occurred in a bar or in a nightclub, that was it. The gossip may have got round the university or the college or what have you, and that was it. Now it's there in perpetuity because it's there on things like Facebook, on Twitter and things like that. So we've got that, which, you know, not wishing to sort of capitalise that as researchers, that's phenomenal data that we can have a look at as well as. But yeah, so I think that may have fueled the perception that it is more problematic now than it has been. I would argue that it's not.
I was particularly struck by what you were saying about sort of laddism rather than being kind of embodied in individuals, but being about kind of social spaces and stuff. And actually, when I looked at what the solutions were that were coming out from the universities, they did seem to be quite individualistic. Yeah. And I wonder whether there's more that we need to be doing or thinking about doing that's about changing some of the social spaces in which laddism is kind of developing.
I agree entirely. I think we need to be looking at different ways and taking the emphasis away from that individual approach to bringing about culture change. Not easy to do, but I think some of the student union initiatives are really interesting, and they're trying to do that, I think, bring about that culture shift. And we'd be good to see how effective they are. But I do worry that they are likely to be... It's really topical at the moment. The student unions are doing loads of stuff on it, but I don't know how long-lived that will be, and I think universities, therefore, need to take this on as well.
You mentioned secondary schools, and I know secondary schools are under increasing pressure to provide all of the things that kids need to know about the world and perform in the world as good citizens. I was just wondering if you could provide any kind of insight as to the kind of things that secondary schools could do to kind of address lad cultures or to make them safer places for all students.
I think one of the things, I mean, there's been a lot of campaigning at the moment around sex education and just how really terrible it is in secondary schools, and Mark will be able to say much more about this than I can. But there's so little discussion about issues around consent. It's very much kind of a kind of biological model of, sex that just really doesn't equip students, I think, for issues around consent and how to approach sexual relationships, sexual relationship education and relationship education more broadly. And I think that would be what, in relation to this particular talk, one really important thing that people keep pushing for, but the government unusually aren't listening.
But let's once again thank Carolyn for absolutely super.